Right, hello everybody, and welcome to this event organised by Co-op Wales. Thank you so much to David and Chris for inviting me to host today. I'm hopefully going to be keeping everyone in line. For those who don't know me, my name is Rebecca Harvey. I'm the editor of Co-op News, which is a magazine and a news website about and for the global co-op movement. Um, so we're sitting here today. We're just over halfway through the International Year of Cooperatives, which of course does have the theme Co-ops Build a Better World. But there are a few other anniversaries that I thought I'd pick out as well because the co-op movement's been going for a while. And this year it's also the 250 years of the Building Society movement. It's 100 years of the Woodcraft folk. It's 180 years of the Rochdale Pioneers. It's 130 years of the International Cooperative Alliance. So there's lots of nice round numbers in 2025. And of course, we're also 1 year into a Labour government that, as part of their manifesto, pledged to double the size of the co-op and mutual economy. I know some people were there this week at the UK Co-op Congress in Rochdale, but for the few days before that, it was also the International Cooperative Alliance General Assembly in Manchester. So there were over 460 people from about 60 countries, representing 100 countries from around the world, who all converged in Manchester for this event. And for so many people, it's a pilgrimage. People are so excited about coming to Manchester, seeing what's happening with our government, seeing what's happening with the Rochdale Pioneers, going into Tote. It's an absolute pleasure for so many people. And the UK is held up as an example, and it feels like we do have a lot to live up to in the global context. And yesterday, of course, was the International Day of Cooperatives as well. And that has the theme of co-ops driving inclusive and sustainable solutions for a better world. And some people may have heard me say things like this before, but the idea of building, of driving, of cooperating, they are doing words. But what are we building? What are we doing? What are we cooperating for? And are we doing it well enough? And I would say probably not, because if we were, more people would know about co-ops and they'll be flying less under the radar. So I joined Co-op News about 12 years ago. And when I first saw the job, I thought it was with the co-op shop because that was the only co-op that I knew. And I know there's countless other stories of people around the world who, if they don't have that family background or that cultural background in cooperatives or the labour movement, they're just not aware of it. And that's what today is going to be all about. Why co-ops are flying under the radar compared with other public and private enterprises. So what do we need to do to rebalance the question, and why is it critical for the future? So I'm delighted to, in a moment, introduce Colin Talbot, who's Emeritus Professor at the Manchester University. And this year he's been writing a series of articles for Co-op News. And later on in the meeting, I'll make sure there's a link in the chat where you can go and read all of Colin's contributions. So we'll hear from him for about 15 minutes. And then after that, we're going to hear from Emma Hodnott, who is at the moment Assistant General Secretary at the Co-op Party, from Glenn Bowen, the Enterprise Director at Compass, Cheryl Barrett, who's the Chair of Co-ops UK, and Rachel Garrick, who's from Monmouthshire County Council. Then after that, there'll be about a 5 minute break, and then we'll bring everyone back and we'll have a good discussion, lots of times for questions. Because I love hosting these events, but then there's usually only about 5-10 minutes of questions at the end, and everyone has things to say. So I'm delighted we'll probably have about 45 minutes to an hour for a really good conversation. Just to let people know, this will be recorded and will be going on the Co-op Wales website and on YouTube. So if you'd rather not have your face shown, please do turn off your camera. It may be helpful as well if people could keep themselves on mute, at least for the first section, just so it's not doesn't interfere with the recording. And please do feel free to put questions in the chat during the conversation, and myself, Chris, and David will be keeping an eye on that as well. So, Colin, the floor is yours. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Can everybody see the slide all right? Yep, fine.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so as Rebecca said, I'm retired from the University of Manchester where I was, well, still am technically Professor of Government. So why am I talking about cooperatives? So I'm going to do a quick romp around the sort of intellectual journey I've been on, not necessarily in the order in which it occurred, but and it's all in pictures, so you're not going to get lots of words thrown at you on PowerPoint slides, assuming I can get these to move, that is. Ah, yeah, there we are. So I just decided that a simple way of doing this was to put up a load of books. As you can see, I've got quite a few behind me. as a way, these are not necessarily the most symbolic or the most important ones, but it's a way of telling an intellectual story very quickly. So, starting with practical innovation in government, one of the things that I've been worrying about for the last 2 or 3 years is how on earth a Labour government coming to power in the current circumstances was going to improve the big public services, in particular the ones that employ a lot of people, like health, education, and social care. And one of the things I looked at, and I did a podcast with Alan and Dean, the authors of Practical Innovation in Government last year, was how we can improve productivity in what the Americans call human services, which is things like health, education, social care, those sorts of areas. There are human services in the private sector as well, like getting your hair cut and restaurants and things like that. But the big chunk of public sector employment is in those areas. And what comes across in their book, which is not about cooperatives, but it is about cooperation, because all of the examples they give of bottom-up innovation in public services in the US and 5 other countries are all based around cooperation at the front line of services and drawing on the knowledge of frontline workers and frontline managers to improve public services through the way in which human beings organise to get things done. And that's a very different story from the one that the Labour government's projecting, which is the way in which you improve public services is by pumping money into them, using AI, which is going to solve all our problems. I've never met an AI yet that can change bedpans, but never mind. There's the whole emphasis of the way in which the government's going about this is it's almost like they've got amnesia about what sorts of things you can do in people-centered services to improve the way those services are delivered. Uh, if I just jump down, a couple of examples, one of which I've used in one of the articles I wrote for Co-op News, but I've also written some stuff for the Civil Service News magazine. One is just an example of the things that a lot of people seem to have forgotten. This is a famous book from 1960 by Douglas McGregor. So you may not have heard of the book, but you may have heard of Theory X and Theory Y, which was his thinking about how managers operate. And Theory X was very much based around human beings as rational utility maximizers, and people only worked if you paid them or cajoled them or disciplined them into working, whereas Theory Y was much more about human relations. That's emblematic of an entire series of innovations and research and practices going back to the 1930s, in fact, which a lot of people seem to have just completely forgotten about, that you can improve public services by improving the way in which people work together. And we've seen that recently during the COVID pandemic, the way in which there was spontaneous working together in a lot of areas. The other book on the right hand, on my right hand side, on the Buurtzorg book, was the other thing that I've been particularly interested in, is the Buurtzorg movement in the Netherlands, which again doesn't see itself as a cooperative, but is effectively implementing a lot of cooperative principles in the way in which they operate. For those of you who don't know, Buurtzorg operates adult social care at home through small teams, usually of about a dozen equally qualified nurses who manage themselves. They don't have any managers at all. They now run about half of social care in the Netherlands, domiciliary social care. All of that, thinking about all of that, which I was doing before the election, led me quite a lot to thinking about cooperatives. And I've put Johnston's book up just because it's a good example of the sort of thing that's around. There's another one coming up later on. But obviously the ultimate form of cooperative organization is cooperatives themselves. And this is where I put my hands up and admit that in 30 years of studying organizations and management, which I've got a PhD in, I never really thought about cooperatives. Mainly because, as I was saying in the chat before we started, I've worked mainly in business schools in academia. I'm a late comer to academia, but I've worked mainly in business schools. Nobody ever talked about cooperatives. They simply did not figure. We talked about public sector organisations, we talked about private sector organisations, we occasionally talked about charities and not-for-profits. Cooperatives simply never raise their profile at all. So I've been spending an awful lot of time playing catch up in the last couple of years by reading everything I can lay my hands on about cooperatives. Alongside that, or rather prefiguring it to some extent, Henry Mintzberg, for those of you who don't know, is a Canadian academic on organisations and management, extremely famous, written dozens of books. And Henry wrote a really interesting book 10 years ago in 2015 called Rebalancing Society between public, private, and what he calls plural sector. And the plural sector, as I'll come on to later, is very close to what's now being called the social and solidarity economy. And it's all of those organisations, including cooperatives, that don't fit into the classic divide between public and private sectors. Very interestingly, by the way, I've been talking to Henry about this over the last few months, and one of the things that came up was that he didn't really recognise the role of cooperatives in all of this. He's just been on a big trip to Japan to visit the Sapporo cooperatives, and he's now much more enlightened about the role of cooperatives and the potential of cooperatives. Um, but this partly got me thinking about this is, I think, a very useful lens to think about Labour's commitment to doubling the size of the cooperative sector, because it poses the question, why? What's it for? Why doubling? Where does it fit into the rest of the economy and society? And all of those sorts of questions. And these two books, I think, are really interesting because both of them are about essentially what I mentioned earlier, which is the human side of public services, particularly around things like social care and education and health and other areas as well. There's large elements of this in things like the criminal justice system, particularly in the rehabilitation side of the criminal justice system. And these are a couple of books of people who are thinking about how do we construct a more caring economy in those sorts of sectors. And Alison Pugh's book about connecting in a disconnected world is a really good antidote to all the stuff about AI is going to solve all problem and the revolting picture of having a GP in your pocket, according to Wes Streeting. I personally would rather talk to an actual GP. And so they're both quite useful in terms of thinking about the important ways in which we could actually improve health, social care, education, and community organisations through cooperatives and their structures. And finally, really useful book, Building a Social Science, which has just come out by, sorry, I can't read their names on there. Uh, but what's really interesting about it, which I've been reading in the last couple of weeks, is the way in which, if you go back and look at cooperative thought in the 19th century, it really was an attempt to build a different sort of social science in opposition to particularly the growth of economics and the narrowing of economics down to rational utility maximization and its focus on people as greedy utility maximizers, personal gain maximizers, and trying to build an alternative social science to that. And what struck me about reading that book is that in the 21st century, there's not at the moment an attempt to do the same sort of thing, building on what we now know about the way in which human cooperation has evolved over millennia, not just over the last couple of hundred years, how and why it's evolved. Ian Adderley's new book, is also gives a useful summary of a lot of those developments, but again, it's largely backward looking in terms of the history. Well, history is always backwards looking, but in terms of the cooperative movement, it's thinking about the history of the way in which it emerged and the ideas that informed it then in the 19th century. My argument would be we need to do a lot more to develop that in the 21st century based on what we actually now know. first of all, there's an awful lot of, as you can see, I've been collecting lots of books. Um, there's an awful lot of new stuff coming out about cooperatives over the last decade, decade and a half or so, with lots of new and very interesting ideas about how cooperatives can and should work, and particularly around the idea broadening out to the social and solidarity economy. I think there's a whole load of work that needs to be done about around those, which is focusing on the social and solidarity economy. But I also think behind that, there's a whole load of stuff which we now know about why humans cooperate. And these are just some of the books that have been written in the last 10 years or so about why we're a cooperative species, how and why it evolved, which is something I've been talking and writing about as a sub part of what I did. I wrote a small book called The Paradoxical Primate 20 years ago about why human beings are both cooperative and competitive. And I think there's a whole load of work to be done around that. But in summary, I would say, in terms of practical things that we need to do at the moment, one of the key lessons from all of that is that care with people creates much more cost-effective and effective and impactful human enterprises, and it's something we seem to have forgotten about. And that's one of the strongest arguments for cooperative forms of working, whether it's formal co-ops or something less than a formal cooperative. It's still a very powerful way of organising human activity, and that's why it's taken up in both private and public sectors to some degree at least. Cooperation and ultimately cooperatives themselves are the best way of doing that, but I also think they're the best way of trying to change and improve the care, what I would call the caring sectors, which is health, social care, education, and community sectors. And one of the things I'm disappointed about is that a lot of the discussion about expanding the cooperative sector at the moment is avoiding those areas. And it tends to concentrate on lots of other areas which are very legitimate and very useful and certainly should be developed. But I think there's huge potential for developing in health, social care, and education in particular. The last Labour government certainly expanded in education towards the end when Ed Balls was sponsoring setting up cooperative schools. But since then, it's largely been neglected. And my final point on all of that around the practical side is that we need, as Henry Mintzberg suggested, a much more balanced society around the relationship between public, private, and cooperatives, brackets, social and solidarity economy enterprises. And finally, we need to expand the developing cooperative sector itself, and that needs some theoretical foundations in social science, which I don't think we've quite got yet. At least we need to join up some of those ideas. I'll just finish with one further slide. I came across this quote in oh, Ian Adderley's book from Arizmendi, who was the guy who founded the Mondragon co-ops, a Catholic priest. And this is where I slightly disagree with Henry Mintzberg, because I think plural is actually better applied to society as a whole. Uh, and that what we need is a balance between public, private, and social and solidarity sectors. And interestingly, Arizmendi said, in the mind of cooperatives is the idea that future society will be pluralistic in all its aspects. It's what we used to call the mixed economy, but I don't use that term because the mixed economy implies just public and private. I think the pluralistic economy or pluralistic society is a much better terminology to use, and that's something I think we ought to be adopting. So that's a very quick romp around these issues. Sorry if it's been a bit telegraphic, but that's where my thinking's heading, and I think there's something in some of the things I've been saying here, and I encourage other people to join in the discussion.